Hello, friends. It is Between Two Sundays, the show where we talk about readings between two Sundays. We record this between two Sundays and we post it between two Sundays. So that's why it's called Between Two Sundays. Hi, Mark.
How are you, mate?
I'm between two Sundays.
Really good to see you, Mark.
Yeah, you too, mate. Of course, at the beginning of every show, we talk about how we've lived out of the readings from the Sundays past before we spend a bit more time talking about how we're going to think, or how we're beginning to think into the readings for the Sunday to come. Last week was the 17th Sunday after Pentecost. Mark, what did you carry with you out of the readings from last week?
I ended up sitting it with the Exodus passage,
Right.
And Moses and Aaron's comment to the Israelites, "Draw near to the Lord, for he has heard your complaining." I think we might have discussed just a little bit about this. But there's something in me that feels quite drawn to that passage, just as a reminder that God can handle what's going on in me and you and everyone else.
Yeah.
They're big enough to hear it and respond, and not so petty that he's going to write it off. There's something good about coming to God as we are, not pretending we're in some other space. So I took this as a little bit of an invitation to sit with God and not pretend everything was well.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting because the Exodus package was the one that passage is the one that's I've been sitting with as well. But there's this repetition of this phrase, the whole congregation. The
Yes.
whole congregation complained, and then say to the whole congregation. So Aaron spoke to the whole congregation, and the whole congregation. This whole congregation thing, and it just reminded me that the being the people of God, in whatever stream of connection to God that you take. And look, to be perfect, I mean, let's be perfectly honest, 2/3 of the book that we Christians hold on to belongs to our Jewish brothers and sisters, who do see things ultimately, or specifically in a very different way. But ultimately, it's about a people and their journeying with God. And I think one of the things that really sticks as you read the story through the Hebrew scriptures, if you were to hold the lens up that you get from that as you read the passages in the Christian Testament, then what you see is that as you come into the Christian Testament is that this story is for not just it's not about individuals, it's about groups of people. This is about a congregation. This is about a community. This is about a tribe. This is about a nation. This is about, I think Christianity gets very bogged down in the individualism. Have you given your heart to Jesus Christ? Are you right with God? Is God right with you? And yet we don't see that essentially as the story of the nation of Israel. We see it as a community thing. And I think that this is why probably these words really stand out, because it's about community. And lest we who are following this God in the way of Jesus, colored by this other writing that Jesus people belonged to, lest we forget that it's for whole congregations, for tribes, for nations, for groups of people, not about me. It's about something way bigger than me. And so, yeah, that's what I carried out with me for that. And I'm sort of stuck with it.
Nice.
So there we go. And so from there, we move into the 18th Sunday after
Yeah.
Pentecost. The readings for the 18th Sunday Pentecost are Exodus 17, verses 1 to 7, Psalm 78, verses 1 to 4, and then 12 to 16, Philippians 2, verses 1 to 3, and then Matthew 21, verses 23 to 32. You will find those readings in any good lectionary, wherever any good lectionaries can be found. We happen to source ours from lectionary.library.vanderbilt.edu, because there's a whole bunch of other cool stuff there that you can utilize for your services or your preaching or your song choices or whatever to augment that for the Sunday to come. So go check it out. And we don't get paid to say that because we don't. Shall we walk from Exodus, my friend?
Sure.
Let's
Sounds
do
good.
that. Let's do that. What are you seeing as we kick into this week's readings from Exodus 17?
I'm well, very clearly the theme of quarreling and complaining is continuing. And still they're complaining against Moses rather than God. So it's that mediator that is bearing the brunt of things. And it's God that comes up with a solution here. So Moses is very much the prophet, isn't he? Very much the one listening to God and speaking God's words to the people. The striking of the rock, of course, this is the first of two instances that are similar. Next, Moses will be asked to speak to the rock, but he strikes it. So this is quite a formative moment for Moses. I think there's a danger here that he actually thinks he's figured God out, and how God works in one instance, he eventually acts as though he thinks God is doing the same, yet God is asking something differently of him. Now, and of course, this ends up being the reason that Moses doesn't enter the promised land. This miracle of miracles, as Moses strikes the rock, and then his willingness out of anger to try and repeat it becomes the very reason that he's, as the story is told, the very reason that he doesn't enter into the promised land. Manasseh, Meribah, Massa, Meribah quarreled and tested. Here we're seeing the same thing again. We're really seeing a people who are dissatisfied with what God is doing among them.
Yeah. As I reflected on this, I was reminding myself, and it's interesting you brought it up, that Moses here is the mediator. Paul tells us that as far as the Christian story and following of Jesus is concerned, Jesus is that mediator. So it's interesting that there's, even Matthew's gospel is very, Matthew is very intent on setting Jesus up as a new Moses, this mediator between God and the people, this high priest of high priests, who's going to help people engage with God and connect with God. And so it's interesting that the people are crying out, they're in the desert that God brought them to, and they're crying out for water, and yet they have a whinge to Moses. What's going on?
Yeah.
And it's interesting that line, what shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me. And I had flash forwards from Moses to Jesus. Here he was simply trying to help people connect with God. And yet it irked so many the way that, it seemed to be happening, that they were ready to crucify him and call for his crucifixion. So there's some of those parallels here that I probably would want to sit with a bit longer as we sort of move towards Sunday. But what's really interesting about this story is that, well, this passage anyway, is the way it ends up in verse 17. It says he called the place Massa Meribah because the Israelites quarreled and tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? And that sentence, that question, is one that I hear in my work as a chaplain, day after day after day, in many different forms. It's not necessarily as succinct and as clear as that, but there is certainly a sense of that in the hearts of not just people who would call themselves religious or spiritual, but in other people as well. Where is God? Is God among us or not? Is God here or not? So there's something about this encounter where Moses goes to God and says, I really want to make sure these people know that you're here, know that you're real, know that this is not, their faith is not put in a dud spot, and seeks God on how to do that. It made me think about how, I guess, generally as a Christian, but also specifically as a chaplain, important it is for me to sit down with God and to ask that question. How can I answer the questions? Is God here or not? And how do I do that in a way that doesn't irk people and turn them off, but actually helps draw them closer to the reality that I know of what God is and what God is about. So yeah, that's what.
Mark, I'm wondering in light of that, if our psalm seems to try and answer precisely that, this reminding of us what has happened, what God has done, this over and over, the glorious deeds of the Lord, the wonders he has done. He worked marvels, divided the sea. We will not hide them from their children. We will not hide these deeds from our children. I wonder if there is this very clear sense of, if we're to, firstly, when we're in a place of asking, is the Lord among us or not? One of the very powerful answers to that is what God has done in the past. And this call to remember, which is scattered throughout the Psalms, but throughout the New Testament and throughout Israel's history as well. All these stories we get, these are reminders. The very writing of Exodus is done well after the events, and is a very deliberate, conscious reminder to people who run the risk of forgetting. And so here we have a psalm that's saying, one of the, holding these two together, we end up with maybe one of the ways, when we're asking the big questions of where is God, maybe one of the ways is to look back at when God has felt very present.
Yeah, well, this is exactly where I went with this psalm. I was reminded of the words of a good friend of mine, Richie Crisco, who at a conference once reminded us that we're called to be witnesses, not judges. And if you want to use courtroom language, what does a witness do? Well, a witness simply walks in and talks about what they have seen, what they saw, what they experienced. They don't do anything more than that. It's not their job to convict, not their job to twist someone's arm, not their job to convince. It's their job to just say what they saw. That's what a witness literally is. And if you have a look at the psalm, that's exactly where it goes. And so in terms of that question, is the Lord among us or not, what the psalmist seems to be calling up is, well, to that question, let me tell you what I've seen.
Yeah.
And of course, it's speaking specifically of things that happened through that Exodus story. So whether the psalmist is actually there or not, or whether the psalmist is using second, third, maybe even fourth-hand information or stories or stuff that's written down elsewhere, at the end of the day, this is a parable of a psalm that uses that exact formula of, well, let me tell you what I've seen. And then you can take that, you can leave that, but all I can do is say, here's what happened for me,
Yeah.
or here's what happened for our people. And it speaks very strongly to that idea of what we're called to do and what we're called to be. All we're called to simply do is to share our experience. And that doesn't come down to, you hear people talking about, share your testimony. And you'll hear people drum up these really, I'm not taking away from, bad things happen to people. And yes, they encounter God that brings them stuff. But it's almost like let me see if I can put a trump card down on yours for a worse experience in which God intervened. These horror stories of what's happened to me. Whereas, there's a lot of people out there. I remember some kids coming up to me in a school where they'd had one of these American music groups come through at a lunchtime, and they'd shared stories about how one girl through it, how her mother sort of ditched her as a baby. Another guy talked about how he'd turned to alcohol in his late teen years and became addicted really, really young. And a few other stories like that. Another girl was raped or something like that. And that they talked about how through these experiences they encountered God somehow. I had some students come up to me later and say, hey, I'm not taking anything away from those stories or the reality that happened for those people, but I've never been addicted to alcohol. My parents have never ditched me, and I've never been raped. Is God for me? And it raises some really interesting questions about what it is that we want to share. You could say, well, it hasn't the psalmist here chosen some amazing stuff? Yeah, but it's simply the story. And so it's simply, this is what we experienced. This is what we saw. This is what we heard. This is what's happened. And, just coming back to that for us to think that doesn't have to be dramatic and amazing or miraculous in that sense. All it has to be is, here's what happened for me. And trusting that God will take our simple, often humble stories and use those as conduits through which to reach into people's lives.
A great reason for those of us who might choose whose stories end up front. A great reminder that we can end up being drawn to the most dramatic, and yet God is at work, I would argue, in all stories, in all lives, in all people. The art is being able to see it.
Yes.
And we want to, there is a tendency to want to put forward the most dramatic and obvious stories as to where God is. You could even argue the psalmist is doing this. collecting all these big moments. Yet maybe it's the celebrating of the obvious, the celebrating of the big moments that reminds us that God is here in the moment that I am struggling to see God.
Yeah. I mean, those moments, were they big at the time? Maybe they were just what was needed at the time. And looking back, they were big. I don't know. Yeah. Well, let's jump into the Christian Testament. Paul, we're in Philippians, and this is one of those, what's the word, watershed passages that people often come back to time and time and time again, and like to quote time and time and time again. What stood out for you as you pondered it, though, on this reading, this time? Remembering that for people like Mark and I, this is not the first time we've read these readings, which is why doing this exercise for 3 years has been incredibly healthy, at least for, I know for you too, but at least, for us, to walk through this and to look at them with fresh eyes and try not to rest on past ways of reading these passages, but to seek God and say, well, what are you drawing us to today?
Mm. What strikes me is possibly linked with what you were just saying before, the nature of testimony. This passage is it seems to function as almost as a telling each other again the story of Jesus. So it's this summary of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus and the hope for the future. But Paul takes this summary, which may not be his own words, it may be that these words exist as a poem already, and Paul's quoting them, so they may be known by the Philippians already. But what he's doing is saying, I want this story to form you. I want this story to so capture your imagination that you begin to live lives that aren't full of selfish ambition or conceit, that you learn not to look to your own interests, but the interests of others, that this same mind would become one with yours. I love this because I think it just boils down to love God and love others.
Funny that.
Yeah. Well, everything does. But really, all this is saying is Jesus loved God well, and it took him through these impossibly difficult, confronting times, and brought him into a place where he was highly exalted. And this is the journey for all of us. This is the journey from life through death to life. And here we see it embraced and not fought by Jesus. And I think Paul is doing something. That there's such a danger that we'll just know the gospel and be right. So we'll have the answers. That's what I mean by be right. We're going to be a people who have the right answers, and we're going to give the right answers. We're going to tell everyone about God, because God has been revealed this way, and we're going to be the people who are in the right. And that kind of becomes the testimony. But Paul seems very dissatisfied with this. If the Philippians know this song already, this poem already, then Paul is not telling them anything new. What is new, or what is surprising, is that he's putting this summary of the story of Jesus into the space of let this story form you, and that will be your testimony to the world. Much more than just going around and repeating this song. They can probably already do that, but Paul wants this to form them, and I think he probably tells this. He probably pulls these two things together in this passage, because they're not living out the story they claim to live by. Yeah. And that is not a distinctly Philippian problem. That's a challenge to all of us. How are we letting this account of God's behavior form us?
Yeah. The passage for me hinges on that verse 5. Let the same mind be in you that it was in Christ Jesus. And then we go into this hymn, some believe, which, or some sort of liturgy, possibly even, that about the kenotic movement, the kenosis of God. And what's interesting about it is that as we read it, it's not being given to us so much as a proof text or as a a doctrinal statement. It's not a creed. What it is it's Paul trying to say, this is the journey Jesus went on. Imagine the mind frame that be required to carry that out. That's the same mind you need to have in you. That's the same humility you need to walk with. That's the same patience you need to walk with. That's the same determination of what you need to do and what you don't need to do that you have to embrace. To the point where, in verse 13, towards the very end, after he said all these things, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you. So you have this Jesus who carves a path, and then Paul saying, now, you're not necessarily going to walk the same path that Jesus walked, and you're certainly not giving up equality with God or anything like that in order to do what you're meant to do, but the same mindset. You need to embrace this, and as you do, remember that your wholeness is coming because God is at work in you, and the trick is to let God do that work in you, and to be open to God doing that work in you as you work forward. So this to me is an incredibly instructive passage, but not in the sense of here's what you need to believe, but here's what's going to transform you into the image of God that you already carry, and allow that to form you more and to be a part more of your shape. That's what really excites me about these words of Paul's, which I think
the essence of this passage. That really is the essence of this passage.
Yeah.
It's not about,
which surprises me, because we tend to think about Paul as this making statements and setting up, do this, do that. But instead here we've got, no, you're on a journey. And in essence, work out your own salvation, your own wholeness. It's going to be different for every person. Yours is not going to look like mine. And I've got thoughts now as I say that out loud ringing through of, we've just talked about testimonies. And sometimes my testimony has to be more flash. Well, I don't have much to say because I heard that guy was going to share. Work out your own. Everyone's journey is different, and not one is better than the other. But what's happening is that God is shaping us as we take those paths. Sorry, I interrupted you.
I can't remember. That's
yeah. And I have no idea what my dog's going off at, but apologies. All right, let's move on to the gospel then. Matthew 21.
Yeah.
Which, again, this is one of my favorite passages, only because I love any passage where Jesus puts the boot in the teeth of religious folk and people who think they've got it all worked out, but they don't. And hear me right when I say this. Jesus here is talking to chief priests, and I'm not at all suggesting that every chief priest Jesus spoke about in the same way. I don't think Jesus, for instance, in speaking of Pharisees, would have turfed Nicodemus in with everybody else. So I think we get an idea, and this is when you hear people talking about Pharisees and teachers of the law, and Sadducees and chief priests. We get these ideas in our head that Jesus was just against everything and everyone that had to do with this system. Nah, I don't see that at all. At the same time, though, I think he's talking to a particular group, or maybe one or two that are there that day who have challenged him and making statements specifically to them. What's really interesting about that is that very last verse in this passage, verse 32, for John came to you in the way of righteousness and you did not believe him, but the tax collectors and the prostitutes did. And what's interesting about that is when you think about what I believe is a great awakening that's happening and has been happening for a number of years, where you have people who are often on the fringes of or even outside of the Christian institution, who are seeing things and sharing things with one another, and this whole groundswell and movement is happening, and a lot of people who have power invested in maintaining a status quo are getting really annoyed by this. But what's interesting is the stories that these people, this fringe and outside the system people, are telling. There are people who the church generally, or Christians generally, might refer to as the tax collectors, prostitutes, and sinners, who are hearing these stories, but who are being attracted to God through them. And I think there's something incredibly powerful about this statement about Jesus, this particular parable about the Father who sends the Son, and they beat up on the Son and kill the Son, who's the messenger person. That, and what we've been talking about, that we've seen revealed in Paul, in the Psalm, and in the Exodus passage, about telling our story and knowing that through that story, people might just happen to be drawn to God by it and through it. But what happens is that the institution quite often, and I speak very generally and broadly here, but the institution quite often will come down on the outliers. You can't tell, you have no authority to say that. You have no authority to think about it in that way. It's interesting. I have no problem with my Catholic brothers and sisters as being followers of Christ, bona fide followers of Christ. But for a long time, I was told that they weren't. And yet, for many people, it was often the beauty of the liturgy or the symbolism or the actions or the way of praying that drew people closer to God. And I'm thinking, God will use whatever God's going to use to draw people closer to who God is. And we've got to be very careful to think that the stories that those outside the system might have to share and talk about aren't going to be as powerful and not contain the same truth, because it might come across different or even draw out different things than the institution. Verse 31, Jesus said to them, I tell you, the tax collectors and prostitutes are going into the kingdom of heaven ahead of you. And I think there's a lesson in that for every single one of us who's been around Christian faith for a very long time, to actually think about what and how God can use anything God chooses, and quite often will, to enable people to be drawn into the kingdom. And that for us to think that A, that way, or B, those people don't deserve to be a part of this, really needs to be kept in check.
There's something really nice about that phrase, ahead of you, I think. It's so hopeful.
Yeah.
These Pharisees and tax collectors, these Pharisees and religious leaders, there's just an order here of going in to the kingdom of God. That's what's being discussed. It's not whether they can or will go in, but there is this door left open by Jesus, isn't there, for these people? You may not see it right now, but the examples of how to respond to my message, the examples are found in the tax collectors and the sinners. Will you learn from them? And there's every possibility that you will. Seems to be what Jesus is saying here. They've seen the same things. They've heard the same stories out of Jesus' mouth. And the simple request is change your minds and believe in him, repent and believe, turn around and trust. And that is completely open to everyone in this story, whether they be people who have failed in obvious ways or people who look like they've never put a foot wrong. Here is this beautiful invitation, and the door is not locked here. Both these sons are asked to come and help their father in the field, and one doesn't. And I think we're left, by the time we get to the end of this passage, with thinking, well, maybe one doesn't yet, and the other has immediately come. One has come first, and, well, we don't necessarily know about the other one. I wonder if there's just something worth seeing here, that the door remains opened to those who find themselves in a religious framework of earning their way into God's kingdom, expecting that of others and expecting that of themselves. But Jesus' story flips that completely on its head. Yet there is hope for all in this little story.
Yeah. It's really interesting that you should say that. I mean, the ahead of you means that, the Pharisees and Sadducees aren't precluded. The people that Jesus is talking to aren't discluded.
Absolutely.
They're just
Jesus
getting it.
Talking to
Okay.
Sorry, Jesus is talking to them because this is worth the conversation, so that they can come in. I don't think Jesus is wasting his words here, just trying to get the conversation right, make sure they know the right answers. Right. Jesus is actually saying, this is for you too. I've welcomed the tax collectors and sinners because they've seen it clearly and early, but it's absolutely for you as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's not that anyone's missing out. It's a case of they're getting it. And they're getting it probably because they don't have the same baggage.
Yeah, one would think. Yeah. Which raises lots of questions about our religious practice. Is our religious practice just giving us baggage and making it harder for us to actually see the radical message, extreme grace that the gospel is?
For a long time, I used the hashtag it's not rocket science. I think far too many Christians make it out that it is. That it's far more complex and difficult and tricky than God actually wants it to be.
Yep. And, sometimes I think that tendency or that gravitation in that direction, to move in that direction, really just comes out of fear. It's really just, I'm so scared that we'll get it wrong. And one day we'll find out that, there was this little technicality in the gospel that we didn't understand. And so God is bound not to let us in. So understanding becomes this key to actually unlocking the scriptures. No one's trying to spruik against understanding and trying to interpret the gospels as faithfully as we can. But I don't know that our salvation depends on us understanding it all. Perhaps we really are just meant to, as I think the tax collectors and prostitutes were doing, just be baffled by it, just be amazed at it, and respond to it without being able to explain it entirely. Respond to it simply because this is the best news we've ever heard.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there you go, my friends. That is the 18th Sunday after Pentecost. Exodus 17 verses 1 to 7, Psalm 78 verses 1 to 4, 12 to 16, Philippians 2 verses 1 to 13, and Matthew 21 verses 23 to 32. Make sure you send us emails, send us, you know where to find us. That's in the links and stuff like that. Tell us what you're thinking, what you're seeing, and what you're hearing as you read those texts. There you go, buddy. There's another week.
Done. Well done.
Awesome. I'm going to go find out what these dogs are cracking off at, and we'll catch you all up next week for another edition of Between Two Sundays. Until then, bless you folks, and we'll see you later. Bye for now.
See you again.